Yeah, I'm gonna make Jiji today! Now in the beginning of the year, I released 2 videos where I showed the process of how I made this Ocarina figure, including Turbo Granny. Back then, I released the videos after the anime has already aired, but not this time. Hey, let's go, I'm locked in recently. Since season 2 is currently airing and it's really good, I've decided that I definitely should do Jiji. Or better said, this poll decided it. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Right now, it's time to make Jiji in his evil eye form. To begin this beautiful process of sculpting, I of course first used some aluminum wire and gathered this together to then throw it in the air and bam, I've got a metal skeleton. Setting that aside, I whipped out a wooden plate with a diameter of 10 centimeters and drilled in a small little hole for the figure to stand in. This is the only point where the figure is attached to the base, so the hole had to fit. Being the professional that I am, I of course drilled in way too deep and added a small little hole into my cutting mat. Now that the hole is drilled into the base, I gave the metal wire the appropriate pose, stuck it into the base and then used some bacon bond to cover the figure. After that I laid down a thin piece of clay on top of the aluminum wire, which magically attached itself to it. That said, it was time to sculpt the anatomy. Now it has been a while since I had to do human anatomy, but I still got the hang of it. I first started by making the rib cage, then added the abs, and before I added the pectoralis major, I had to add the basic shape of the arm muscles. Then it was just a matter of blending everything together until the muscles look the way they should. Now, the pose that Jiji is in is a bit of an anatomical challenge, especially for me because I have never made a figure in a pose like that. So it was really interesting for me to mess with the muscles and how they would behave and how they stretched. And I think that I've pretty much nailed it, actually. Overall, it's just a really good way to improve oneself while sculpting. Because while making this, I have noticed that it's not only about the clay, but also about the wire skeleton and how it runs through the body, because it can get in the way of the clay. Enough said. To sculpt the individual muscles, I mostly cut them to shape, rolled them to shape, and used a little carving tool to carve in some lines, which I then blended using some loop tools that I made myself. Keep in mind that muscles don't really have a sharp line in between them because you do have skin on top of it, which makes it a little bit more smooth. So yeah, that's what I did. Anyway, the muscle contraction was especially interesting in the abs. That is due to the fact that the upper body is turned in a way so that the abs would be aligned in somewhat of a curve. I also had to make sure that the abs weren't too deep because, like I said, there is skin on top of the muscles. And that is besides the fact that in the manga as well as the anime, he kinda appears as if he has body fat in the single digits. Anyways, since I removed way too much clay from the ribs, I had to add the serratus anterior muscles by using some small pieces of clay. These, of course, were also blended onto the clay. I also did basically the same for the right side of the back muscles, because they are kinda squeezed together, meaning that they would stand out a little bit more. Naturally, I also had to carve some lines there and use the loop tool again to make the muscle more seamless. And hey, I almost forgot to add the clavicles, which I then did by adding 2 small clay sausages in between the shoulders and the chest. With that, the torso is basically finished, so I moved on to the legs. Not much to say here since it's the exact same process that I did with the upper body, only that the muscles are much bigger, so I didn't have to add that much detail. Now, in this point of time it was a little bit difficult to hold the figure and not ruin any detail as well as continue to sculpt it, so I had to glue it onto the wooden base. Usually I do it at the end of the figure to assemble the entire thing, but this time it was inevitable because I also had to sculpt the individual toes. Sculpting the calves is a little bit annoying because the clay is mostly moving away from the wire, but I somehow managed. Like I said earlier, I also had to sculpt the individual toes. Since he is standing on one leg, they had to be kind of spreaded because that way he would have more stability while standing. Of course, this isn't really the case with this figure because I'm using a very hard wire, but it's just for realism. With the lower body being done, I had to add the remaining details of the entire body. The first thing was the hands. One is a fist and one is an open hand. For the fist, I first added the palm, then the fingers and the thumb. Quite simple, but since it's a little bit difficult to reach the individual areas, that was a little bit of a challenge. As for the open hand, I used some thin wires and first made a skeleton for the hand. I glued those together by using some green stuff. Once the green stuff was dried, I used some super Sculpey and covered the entire hand with the clay. That way I am able to sculpt the fingers relatively easy. Each time I make it, it gets easier and easier, but it still can be quite the challenge. Once that was done, I stuck it onto the blunt side of the other arm and added some more clay to blend in together the seams. As for the fingers of the closed fist, I did basically the same thing that I did with the muscles. First I drew in the fingers and then carved them out using the carving tool. Now that the hands are done, I moved on and started sculpting the head. As always, I rolled out a clay ball in the appropriate size and added another piece of clay to make the jaw. As for the eyes, I cut away a little bit of clay and then pressed it in until I was happy with how it looks. After that, I added a clay noodle for the nose and pressed in the mouth. Evil Eye is usually not that happy looking, so I made sure that the eyebrows were looking downward to make him appear angry. Speaking of Evil Eye, I had to add the third eye, which I did by gluing a thin oval piece of clay on the forehead. And to add a little bit more detail, I went ahead and pressed in a few circles onto the eye. With the head now baked, I had to also add the ears. And to do that, I glued on a spiral-shaped clay noodle on each side of the head, to which I then added more detail. After the head was baked for a second time, I went ahead and glued it onto the figure. And just like with the hands, I blended together the seams, but I also had to add the neck muscles. Now in this point of time, I was kinda wondering, wouldn't it be funny if I were to add the nipples? So I asked you guys on Instagram on a poll, and an overwhelming amount of guys thought, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, boy.
And so I did. Until I decided that, yeah, this shit looks ass, bro. I will just draw them on later.
No.
Jiji is now bald. But we don't want that. That said, I needed to make the hair. And to do that, I used a lot of pointy clay pieces and just glued it on top of the head until I was satisfied. And don't forget the very important detail to add the ahoge. If you don't know what an ahoge is, it's basically just a hair that is standing up, mostly in characters that are basically idiots. Ah, and I almost forgot, I needed to add his underwear. So before the police comes, I rolled out a thin piece of clay and covered his crotch area, to then cut out the shape of the underwear. And to give it a little bit of texture, I carved in the seam lines of the underwear, which I would later paint over with black paint anyways. Now, you might be wondering why Jiji is standing in this position. You probably aren't wondering that, I just don't care. He is trying to shoot his little soul ball, so I went ahead and did that. Since I wanted the ball to appear to be floating, I had to use a thin acrylic rod, but this would bend, so I needed to use super Sculpey light to make the base of the ball. I just took a piece of clay and rolled it into a ball, which I then baked in the oven. To add the detail, I used many circular clay pieces and covered the entire ball with it. To make it seem more uniform, I had to blend these clay pieces together, and I used a ball stylus to also add the details of the soles. To do that, I simply pressed 3 different sized holes into each individual bump. And with that, the sculpting process is done, which means I can go ahead and cel shade the figure. I'm gonna do cel shading because, like I said in the Okarun video, Dandadan has a very unique art style and I want to represent that in my figure as well. Starting off, the first thing I did was cover the entire thing in white. This helps making the other colors pop more. Now, before I go ahead and paint the figure, I'm gonna start by painting the base. Similar to Okarun, I have designed the base to make it individually for Jiji. For that, I taped off the individual sections to then cover with acrylic paint, which I'm gonna paint using a sponge. The area that I'm gonna cover green says Dandadan in katakana. Following that up, the area that I'm painting magenta says Jiji in katakana. And lastly, the area that I'm gonna paint blue is a window that shows evil eye. After the tape was removed, I used a Sharpie and marked the edges of each individual letter. I also used the Sharpie to paint in the evil eye in the blue window. I designed this base in a way that the letters for Jiji and evil eye would be in front of each other, but still part of the same piece, because, like in the anime and manga, Jiji is basically fused with evil eye. I then went ahead and started to properly paint Jiji. For that, I covered the entire figure in Violeta Claro from Vallejo. I was lucky because that color matched exactly the one color that I needed, which means I didn't have to mix it. Since I'm cel shading, I still wanted to make the eye appear a little bit more glowy, so instead of purple, I used magenta, which I mixed with a little bit of white and started painting the third eye. I then followed that up by painting the face markings. To achieve this color, I mixed some black with some purple, and like I said, I just started painting. Once the detail on the face with the color was finished, I also went ahead and painted the next section. With that, the basic colors are finished, which means I can now add the shading. For that, I first started with the brighter colors. Now, usually Evil Eye is a rather pale color. The anime, however, decided that when he uses his soul ball, the entire area would shift to purple. Personally, I think this looks much more interesting, which is why I chose to make this for this figure, especially since I'm also using the ball. In my opinion, the ball is also in a way a source of light, which is why I had to figure out where the light would shine on the figure. To do that, I first took a blue LED, diffused it with a little bit of tape, and then took a picture from the position where the ball should be. After a little bit of editing, these were the results, meaning that I somehow had the places where the light would shine the brightest. And to properly paint these areas, I mixed some Violeta Claro with white. This is the second time where I'm properly cel shading, or better said, the third time if you count Spider-Man 2099. Yeah, it was just basically freestyle the entire way through. Trust the process, guys. Anyways, it is also important to add some shading onto the darker areas. It's a little bit hard to spot since, yeah, they are kinda dark, but still worth it, and it does make a difference. Once I finished adding the lighter areas, I went ahead and mixed some purple with, yet again, Violeta Claro to achieve the darker areas of the figure. Since the ball is in front of the figure and thus the light source is as well, I mostly painted that in the back area of the figure. However, there are also a few sections in front of the figure where I also had to add this color because it kinda gives a nice contrast. And also it's not like the entire light source is only the ball. It's like, I don't know, kind of an aura that the entire area gets covered with. Well, with the shading completely finished, I went back to the face to paint the eyes. While doing this, I kinda noticed that I did get better at making faces. I mean, this might just be the best face that I've ever sculpted, besides non-human faces like Kaiju number 8 and Chainsaw Man. Anyways, to paint the irises, I again used some magenta mixed with a little bit of white. With them being said, I just had to add the black pupils. It is now time to move on to the line work. To make this, I used the thinnest brush that I had, dipped it in black, and just went to toe with it. There isn't really much to say here, other than I did went to toe with it, and hey, look at that, I did add the nipples. I didn't forget, for those wondering. Since I'm basically freestyling it, I have no clue how. I just somehow tried to mimic the Dandadan manga art style, but it's a bit difficult in figure form, but it's just overall a mixture of cross-hatching and normal line work. I did, however, try to add a little bit more cross-hatching in the areas that were a little bit more stretched. I don't know if you can really notice, but it's there. Another thing that I used cross-hatching for was to add further shadows. Now let's set it aside and return to the ball. Just like with the figure, I covered it in white. I used some watered down purple acrylic paint and covered the entire ball with it. Once that was dried, I also kind of dry brushed some Violeta Claro. I always have to look up the name, I can't remember it. Yeah, setting that aside, there is one last thing missing, and these are the earrings. I did roll out a thin piece of mixed green stuff that is already hardened and cut out two rectangles with a hole in the middle. That's simply what it is. These two rectangles were then also covered in white, because I then covered them in magenta, yellow, green, blue and purple. I then glued them on off camera because it wasn't really easy to get the position right, but here's the finished figure. Enjoy! Whew. Well, what can I say? This figure was a lot of fun to make. It took longer than I wanted it to take because I still have a lot of plans before I go to university. But hey, it was really fun and it was totally worth it. And I'm really proud of it. I do have plans to make the entire Dandadan gang eventually. I just don't know when, but I suggest that you should follow me if you want to see them. I have done many other figures in the past and I will continue to do many more figures in the future. So if you want to stay up to date with what I'm doing, you should also follow my Instagram. I post regular updates there and you can stay up to date with what I'm doing on a daily basis. Like I said before, this is the third time cel shading and I want to do more. It is really fun and the figures always turn out amazing. I just need a little bit more practice, but I think the more I do it, the better I will get. If you want to see the progress, follow me. I am really hyped with the next figure that I intend to make. So yeah, hopefully I see you guys in the next 2 weeks and not in the next month. I hope you enjoy the rest of the week and see you guys next time. Bye bye!